The leader looks like the Israelite.
For all that we have discussed thus far, there are a few passages that pro-slavery Christians pointed to in order to justify both their racist attitudes towards blacks and the harsh treatment of their slaves. Genesis chapter 9 verses 24 through 27 state, quote, "When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers.' He also said, 'Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant.'" Some, though not all, defenders of the African slave trade appealed to this passage to justify its lawfulness, the argument being that the curse of Canaan, a son of Ham, constituted a divine decree of slavery for his lineage. Granville Sharp responds to this charge.
For the Africans are not descended from Canaan. The Africans are principally descended from 3 other sons of Ham, Visbiat, Cush, Mizraim, and Put. The insinuation therefore concerning the sentence expressed against Canaan can by no means justify the African slave trade.
The Mosaic sanction of quote-unquote slavery, as we have already examined, was regulated in both economic exchange and personal rights, even for foreigners. It was contrasted with the tyrannical example of the Egyptians. Thus, any application of Canaanite servitude to Israel in the Old Testament is far removed from the corruption and abuse of European and later American slavery of Africans. Pro-slavery exegetes were fond of pointing to the patriarchs as examples of biblically legal slavery.
Abraham, the friend of God, and Isaac, the most holy and spotless of the patriarchs, were great slaveholders. That these were actual slaves is clear, because the words for bondsman and bondsmaid here used are in every case Ebed and Shiphe, which are defined by every honest lexicon to mean actual slaves, which are used in that sense alone everywhere else in the Hebrew Scriptures, which are contrasted in the book of Leviticus with the hired servant, or sasir.
This argument fails to take into account 2 things. First, it fails to recognize the economic system of the Middle Bronze Age, one that was pre-monetary. Abraham's wealth was not in money. It was in goods, property, and labor. Yes, Abraham's servants are called avadim, but, as already mentioned, avadim is a term of spectrum, with an appropriate application, quote-unquote servant, and an inappropriate one, quote-unquote slave. Abraham's servants were not subject to the hard labor, abuse, and murder the Hebrews would later experience in Egypt, though both groups are referred to as avadim. Abraham compensated his servants, like an employer compensates his or her employee. This compensation was not monetary because Abraham didn't have a currency. Instead, the compensation was one of residence and inheritance. Abraham's servants traveled with him and his family, and it was his duty to provide them with food and shelter as a contractual obligation for his servants' labor. Abraham even armed his servants with their own weapons. Finally, Abraham circumcised his servants, which counted them as inheritors in his covenantal blessing with God, just like his natural children. This is not the slavery of the Egyptians, nor is it the slavery of the Americas. It was Middle Bronze Age indentured service that was contractually compensated and individually respected by Abraham. Further, Abraham's example comes at the beginning of God's covenantal revelations to mankind. Christian theologians have recognized across the whole of church history the progressive nature of revelation, that God did not reveal everything in his plan at once up front. Christ is the fulfillment of the law, and for anybody claiming to be a Christian, his example is the one which we are at present accountable to. Christ specifically, and the New Testament more generally, forbid and abrogate practices that would have been legally tolerated in Abraham's day due to a lack of revelation. Polygamy is a prime example of this. Abraham had multiple wives and concubines, yet the New Testament instructs men to be the, quote, husband of one wife. The New Testament also instructs the master and slave to regard one another as brethren. thereby equalizing the covenantal status of each and making them both accountable to the respect and love they are to afford each other. Though Abraham's example is one which models respectable Middle Bronze Age indentured service in an age prior to God's first revealing of the law, it is made irrelevant to the Christian who claims to follow the example of Christ in the New Testament. Again, it was Christ himself who extolled the Golden Rule as the second greatest commandment. Any pro-slavery Christian who himself did not desire inhumane labor without compensation, a subhuman legal condition, abuse of the lash, the involuntary dissolution of his family, and no true guarantee of his freedom, while imposing such conditions on another, has violated Christ's words, making the word of God nullified by his cultural traditions. For all we have examined so far, there are a few quote-unquote challenging texts that both pro-slavery Christians and biblical skeptics point to in arguing that the Bible 1. Allowed for abusive treatment of slaves, and 2. Treated slaves as chattel property. The first is Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 and 21. Quote, "If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod, and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property." A few preliminary observations will help us interpret this verse appropriately. Exodus 21 is the same chapter which prohibits both kidnapping, the abusive treatment of slaves, and murderous attacks. The cumulative weight of the context tells us that Moses is not allowing for someone to get away with murderous intent. In other words, to knowingly abuse their slaves short of immediate death, and then to leave them to die of their injuries at a later date. If such intent was demonstrable before the elders and judges of Israel, that person would be subject to capital punishment. Instead, the law here is attempting to give the benefit of the doubt to a master in a disciplinary setting. Yes, the Mosaic law allowed for physical discipline of servants. No, that did not mean it gave the master carte blanche to abuse them at his or her whim. If a servant died at a later time as a result of disciplinary action, the default position of the law regarding the master is that it was an accident, unless murderous intent could otherwise be proven. Not unlike our standard of innocent until proven guilty, which we abide by in our modern legal system. But what of the clause which describes the slave as the master's property? The Hebrew word here is kesef, which literally means money or silver. Many English translations therefore render this clause as, quote, "the slave is his money." What the Torah is saying here is that the servant is a source of wealth for the master. You, as an employee, are a source of wealth for your employer because of the labor that you render for them. It does not mean that you personally are the property of your employer, but the results of your labor are via contract. This is an equivocal relationship to a master and indentured servant in Bronze Age Israel. The master owned the fruits of the servant's labors and profited off of them via contract. In our day, the wealth of your labor is compensated for monetarily, in cash or credit. In the ancient world, prior to the widespread use of currency, the wealth of a servant's labor was compensated for by food, shelter, and inheritance among the family or community of his or her master.
The suggestion here isn't that servants were chattel or property. The servant employee came into the master's employer's house to get out of debt. So the employer stood to lose money if he mistreated his employee. His harsh treatment toward an employee could impact his money bag.
Another text is Exodus 21, verses 2 through 6. Quote, "If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man,' then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. The charge is that chattel slavery is encouraged by the reference to a servant's wife and children belonging to his master, even if he goes free. Dabney echoes this sentiment.
Here is involuntary slavery for life, expressly authorized to God's own peculiar and holy people, in the strongest and most careful terms. The relation then must be innocent in itself.
Again, the context here is not the antebellum slavery of the American South. It is the indentured servitude of the late Bronze Age in the ancient Near East, in a pre-monetary society. Note the phrase, quote, if his master gives him a wife. Moses is describing an arranged marriage of a debt servant. Being in debt to his master, a man in indentured service would have his end of marital arrangement negotiated by his master. Therefore, upon the consummation of the marriage, the wife, and subsequently their children, would be subject to the same indentured service as the husband. A rough modern analogy to this situation would be a military service person who gets married during their term of service. They're still contractually obligated to fulfill their term to the military, even though they got married in the middle of it. Being that the wife and children were also subject to the husband's indentured service contract, if he decided, for whatever reason, to walk out on his contract early, the wife and children would legally remain with the master to serve out the labor the husband failed to fulfill. This statute is an example of a case law written to protect a wealthy individual's investment, not to condemn a poor person to lifelong chattel slavery. That the nature of this arrangement was temporary and contractual is stated in verse 2, quote, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man. The only mention of lifelong servitude is as a voluntary commitment on behalf of the servant because he has a good, loving relationship with his master. This is an example of ancient Israelite case law, which application was to be appropriately administered by the elders and judges of Israel in the event of a suit. It is not a blind, absolute command that all Israelites are to keep female and child servants as chattel for life. Again, this is not an economic ideal that modern society needs to apply. It is a culturally relevant arrangement given to a people who are wandering in the desert in a society that is pre-monetary and pre-industrial. Modern Christians do not need to exchange our current forms of economic exchange for indentured service. But in Israel's day and situation, it made sense for some people and was therefore legally overseen. Perhaps the Old Testament passage that was most championed by pro-slavery advocates was Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. Quote, as for your male and female slaves whom you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you, to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves. But in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. What do we make of this? Again, a few preliminary observations will behoove us. First, Leviticus earlier states, quote, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Regardless of who was in Israel or how they got there, their treatment was legally defensible on all the ground we have already covered. They could not be kidnapped, they could not be abused, and they were to be treated with an overall disposition of empathy, compassion, and fairness. Second, the terms sojourner and alien can refer to multiple types of people, either of compassionate or hostile nature. Rahab or Ruth, for example, would have been a sojourner or an alien, but their covenantal allegiance was to Yahweh, even though they were of foreign heritage. They would have participated in Passover, eaten kosher food, kept the Sabbath, and, for the males, been circumcised. A second category of sojourners and aliens would have been foreign merchants passing through Israel for trade. They did not bear covenantal allegiance to Yahweh and did not participate in any of the rites or customs of Israel. However, their intentions would not have been hostile. They came simply to do business. Mosaic law allowed for these people to consume non-kosher foods while doing business in Israel. This was an act of accommodation to show love to foreigners. A final category of these people would have been those with hostile intent. Think of either prisoners of war or foreigners who came in trying to either politically overthrow Israel's leadership and or move the people to practice the worship of false gods. Such people could be conscripted into forced labor on behalf of the state to subdue any seditious intent. However, at any time, these people had the opportunity to convert to a covenantal embrace of Yahweh by participating in circumcision and practicing the Torah. The terms stranger, sojourner, alien, and foreigner could be applied to any of these groups. It should be obvious that there are legal differences accounted for because each group represents a different intent to make Israel either prosper or crumble. The law, therefore, allowed Israelite leadership to enforce statutes of service if the situation was deemed to be beneficial to Israel's well-being. Leviticus 25:44-46 is again an example of case law. It was enforceable at the discretion of leadership. It was not an absolute statute that the average Israelite could enforce from a position of rogue vigilantism. In a pre-monetary, pre-industrial society, this is how Israel was allowed to do business. Third, the word acquire in verses 44 and 45, sometimes rendered as purchase or buy, is kana. This word is the same word Boaz uses to describe his marriage to Ruth. It is also used in Proverbs 8:22 to describe Yahweh's relationship to wisdom. Thus, this word doesn't necessitate a status of property on behalf of the slave or servant. It is only used to describe possession. Again, if you don't have money or goods to offer in the Bronze Age, you could offer yourself for the services that you could perform. For foreigners, they could be conscripted as a result of war or transgressions of the law. If so, their service could be contractually passed on to the master's next of kin. Is this an economic ideal for all people of all time? No. Is it one we should return to in the present day? No. But it was a part of Israel's world in the Bronze Age, and it was regulated according to the moral statutes of the Torah to be better than the pagan nations that surrounded them. Fourth, and with respect to the question of antebellum American slavery, perhaps the most important, verse 47 allows for these foreign people to be able to buy their freedom and even to acquire Israelite servants. Contrast this with what happened in American slavery. Imagine if a black man were not only able to buy his freedom, but then purchase a poor white person as a slave. Such an idea would have been anathema to pro-slavery Americans, because their slave system was based fundamentally on ideas of racial superiority, not the Bible. For the Christian, any appeal to the Mosaic law must be made through Christ. Christ has fulfilled the law for all those who are in faithful relationship to Him. As such, He has abrogated those portions of the law that separate Jews from Gentiles. He has also elevated those portions of the law to which all people are obligated. The Mosaic laws pertaining to slavery were for a particular time and place under particular economic conditions. These conditions, of the Bronze Age, have passed away. Jews and Gentiles are now living next door to one another, and we are blessed with modern currency and industry. In any context subsequent to the end of the Old Covenant age, the regulation any person is most bound to from Christ's words himself is to love God by surrendering your life to Him through Christ, and to love people by treating them the way you want to be treated. American slavery not only failed to imbibe the Old Testament commands, but it more greatly failed with respect to Christ's very words. Still, pro-slavery theologians still made attempts to claim that the New Testament example allowed for the keeping of slaves, and therefore they were justified as Christians to practice slavery. We will turn our attention to these passages next.